Story 1. The whispers of the board. The first mistake was the dust. Thick, gray, and tasting of forgotten things, it clung to the Ouija board like a second skin. Liam was the one who spotted it, shoved back on a high shelf in the corner of a cramped antique shop, half hidden by a stack of brittle, yellowed postcards. "Look at this," he said, his voice a low hum of faint excitement. He knew Chloe and Ben would be thrilled. They were always looking for a cheap thrill, an adrenaline shot to punctuate the mundane rhythm of their lives. Chloe, with her short, dark hair and eyes that always seemed to hold a flicker of defiant mischief, came over first. She ran a finger over the ornate, Gothic lettering carved into the board's surface. Seriously. An actual one. Not some plastic modern knockoff. Ben, ever the skeptic, with his lanky frame and perpetually tired expression, gave a cynical laugh. "It's a children's toy. A prop. You two are ridiculous." But he didn't protest when Liam pulled out his wallet. The shop owner, a man with a face like a crumpled paper bag, quoted a price so low it was insulting. "Old thing. Never had much luck with it myself," he mumbled, his eyes darting away from theirs. Back at their shared apartment, a cramped space above a laundromat that always smelled faintly of fabric softener, they laid the board out on the coffee table. The wood was cold to the touch, and the planchette, a simple heart-shaped piece with a glass eye, felt heavy and strange. "All right, let's get this over with," Ben sighed, leaning forward. "We'll ask it something easy. Something no one could possibly know." They extinguished the lights, leaving only a single, flickering candle in the center of the board. The orange glow danced, casting long, shifting shadows that made the familiar room feel alien. They each placed a finger lightly on the planchette, the three of them connected by the cool, smooth surface. "Is anyone there?" Liam asked, his voice a low whisper. Silence. The planchette remained motionless. Ben snorted. "See? Nothing. Can we get some pizza now?" "Wait," Chloe said, her eyes fixed on the board. "Let's try again. It needs a moment." She closed her eyes. "Hello. Is there a spirit with us?" Suddenly, the planchette shuddered. A cold draft snaked through the room, making the candle flame stutter and dim. The planchette began to move, slowly at first, then with a steady, deliberate glide. It moved to the yes at the top of the board. Ben's jaw went slack. He yelped and snatched his hand back as if the planchette were a hot coal. "No way. That was one of you." Chloe shook her head, her eyes wide with genuine surprise. "It wasn't. My hand wasn't even moving." "What's your name?" Liam asked, his voice thick with a mix of fear and exhilaration. The planchette moved again, faster this time. "Malachi," Chloe whispered. "That's a real name. That's creepy." They continued their session, their initial skepticism replaced by a morbid fascination. They asked Malachi simple questions. "How old are you?" The answers were vague, spooky, and exactly what they would expect from a prank. But the feeling in the room, the strange coldness, the way the shadows seemed to press in on them, was undeniable. They ended the session by moving the planchette to goodbye, and put the board away, each of them silently processing the bizarre experience. For a week, nothing happened. Life returned to its normal rhythm of work, cheap takeout, and binge-watching old television shows. They almost forgot about the board, relegating the strange night to a funny story they'd tell people at parties. Then came the first whisper. It was Liam who heard it. He was alone in his room, trying to fall asleep, when a low, sibilant sound, like dry leaves skittering across pavement, slithered from the corner. "You are weak." The voice was thin and dry, like dust, and it was right next to his ear. He bolted upright, his heart hammering against his ribs, and flicked on the light. The room was empty. He passed it off as a half-asleep hallucination, but the next day, Chloe came home early from work, her face pale. "My boss asked me why I missed work last week. I told him I was there, but he said I wasn't. He said I was lying." Liam and Ben exchanged a look. Chloe hadn't missed work last week. They had all been together. He said he saw me leaving, but then he saw me coming back later that day, Chloe said, her voice trembling. He said I looked different. Like I wasn't me. Ben tried to be logical. Maybe it's a mix-up. A misunderstanding. But he couldn't shake the memory of the board, of the way the planchette had moved with a will of its own. That night, they decided to try the board again. They were scared, but also desperate for answers. Maybe Malachi could explain what was happening. Liam, his hands shaking slightly, placed his finger on the planchette. Malachi. Are you there? The planchette moved instantly to, yes. What is happening to us? Liam asked, his voice barely audible. The planchette moved. Sleeper. Ben repeated, his brow furrowed. What does that mean? The planchette moved again. The cryptic message sent a chill down their spines. The coldness in the room was back, more intense now. The candle flickered violently, and a framed photograph on a nearby shelf slid off and shattered on the floor. Ben flinched, and for the first time, Liam saw real fear in his eyes. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. The apartment felt like a cage. A dripping sound from the kitchen, a single, hollow tap that echoed long after they checked the sink. A whisper so close to Liam's ear he could feel a cold breath on his neck. The whispers returned, more frequent and more sinister. For Liam, they were about his past. Your father saw her. He had always wondered why his father had left his mother so suddenly, and the board, it seemed, was preying on that open wound. For Ben, the whispers were about his failures. You could have saved them. He had a secret guilt he had never shared, a car accident from years ago that he blamed himself for. The whispers tormented him with it, mocking him. And for Chloe, the whispers were the worst. He will find you. She had a stalker in college, a dark, terrifying secret she had buried deep. The whispers unearthed it, filling her with a dread so profound it was almost paralyzing. They stopped sitting in the same room. Chloe ate her meals alone in her bedroom, a knife by her plate. Ben spent hours staring at the front door, convinced it would open on its own. Liam found himself jumping at his own shadow, the silence of the apartment more terrifying than any noise. They stopped talking about the board, but its presence, its silent, creeping influence, was everywhere. One evening, as Chloe sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, Ben approached her, his face grim. Something's wrong with your phone, he said, holding it out. The screen was covered in a repeating series of words, forming a pattern. The words were from the board, rearranged, like a ransom note. Chloe screamed and threw the phone across the room. The turning point came when they decided to get rid of the board. They had to. It was ruining their lives, their sanity. We'll burn it, Liam declared, his jaw set. We'll burn the damn thing and be done with it. Ben and Chloe agreed without hesitation. They carried the board outside to their small backyard, a patch of cracked concrete behind the apartment building. As they placed it on the ground, a cold wind kicked up, making them shiver despite the unseasonably warm air. The sky, which had been clear just moments ago, was now a bruised shade of purple. Liam poured lighter fluid over the wood. He could feel a resistance, a physical sensation in his hands as he held the bottle, as if the board itself were pushing back. He struck a match and tossed it onto the wood. The flame, instead of catching, turned a sickly, cold black and then winked out the moment it touched the wood. The fluid on the board bubbled and hissed like acid but left no mark. Liam tossed another match, and another, but each one met the same fate. A faint, echoing laugh seemed to rise from the wood itself, and for a terrifying moment, the wood of the board seemed to flex, to breathe. It's not working, Ben said, his voice laced with a new kind of terror. It won't let us. A deep, bone-rattling laugh echoed in the small yard. It wasn't a human laugh. It sounded like the creaking of old bones, the grinding of dry rock, and the rustling of dead leaves all at once. The air grew frigid, and a thin, spectral mist began to rise from the surface of the board. What is happening? Chloe shrieked, backing away. It's Malachi, Liam said, his voice a hoarse whisper. The mist coalesced, forming a vague, humanoid shape. It was dark, shadowy, with no discernible features, but they could feel its presence, a profound and ancient malice that was focused entirely on them. You don't get to leave, the dry voice from the board whispered, echoing in all of their heads at once. You invited me in. Now you are mine. They fled back into the apartment, slamming the door shut. The world outside seemed to disappear. The windows were black, and the air was thick with a suffocating dread. The board was back on the coffee table, a faint, malevolent glow emanating from its surface. Ben, his face ghostly white, pointed to the planchette. It was no longer on the board. Instead, it was on the floor, next to a small, worn photograph that had been lying under a book. The photo showed a smiling young woman and a little boy. A boy with bright, innocent eyes. Liam recognized the woman. It was the medium the antique shop owner had mentioned. He picked up the photo, his heart pounding. The little boy's name, scrawled on the back in a faint, spidery hand, was Malachi. The mystery began to unravel. They scoured the internet for information on the medium, a woman named Eleanor Vance. They found a digital archive of old newspaper clippings. Eleanor had been famous in the 1920s, a celebrated spiritualist who claimed to channel the spirit of her deceased son, Malachi. The board was her primary tool. The articles documented her growing fame, followed by a sudden, alarming decline. Her last public appearance was a disaster. She claimed to be speaking to her son, but witnesses reported that her words were full of bile and hatred. She was taken to a sanitarium, and eventually, she simply vanished. Liam found a digitized copy of her last journal entry. The handwriting was erratic, scribbled with a wild desperation. He is not my son. He never was. The thing on the board, it came when I was weak. When I was grieving. It pretended to be him, promised me comfort. It fed on my sorrow. It wanted me to bring others to it. To feed it their fear, their sadness, their secrets. It is a sleeper. It plays with souls. It is not a spirit. It is something else. The journal entry ended with a warning: do not answer it. Do not let it know you see it. It is only powerful when you acknowledge it. Ignore it and it will fade. Feed it and it will consume you. A terrifying realization dawned on them. The entity they had summoned was not a ghost. It was a parasite, a psychic leech that had been dormant in the board for a century, waiting for someone to be foolish enough to awaken it. It fed on negative emotion, on fear, and on the chaos it created. The whispers, the strange events, the way it had turned them against each other, it had all been a harvest. We have to stop feeding it, Chloe said, her voice a low murmur. We have to ignore it. But it was too late. The apartment was now a vortex of its power. The shadows were no longer fleeting. They were solid, moving things, writhing in the corners of their vision. The whispers were no longer in their heads. They were audible, a chorus of malicious voices, mocking, jeering, and taunting. Ben, overwhelmed, broke first. He started screaming at the shadows, at the whispers, his mind snapping under the strain. He tried to run from the apartment, but the door wouldn't open. It was sealed shut, as if from the inside. Liam and Chloe tried to calm him, but the board glowed brighter, and the shadows grew more distinct. They saw glimpses of things in the darkness, things with too many limbs and too many eyes, flickering in and out of existence. Liam knew what he had to do. Eleanor had said the entity was only powerful when you acknowledged it. They had to stop. They had to starve it. We have to close our eyes, Liam yelled over Ben's screams. We have to stop looking at it, stop listening to it. We have to pretend it isn't there. Chloe, her face streaked with tears, understood. She squeezed her eyes shut, covering her ears. Ben, however, was too far gone. He was lost in the grip of the entity, a puppet of its terror. Liam closed his own eyes, but the mental onslaught was a physical force. The whispers grew louder, more personal, screaming his deepest fears. He felt a cold hand on his shoulder, a crushing weight. He felt fingers crawl up his neck, their touch like spiders. He left you. They will, too. You could have saved them, but you were too weak. He is coming for you. He held his breath, forcing himself to not react, to not flinch. He imagined a wall, a thick, impenetrable shield of glass between him and the voices, between him and the cold. He focused on a memory of a time before the board, a time of warmth and laughter. He felt the presence recede. The hand on his shoulder lifted. The whispers dimmed to a faint, far-off buzz. He opened his eyes. The apartment was quiet. Ben was unconscious on the floor, his face pale and drained. Chloe was curled into a ball, shaking. And the board was dark. It was just an old piece of wood again, inert. They had done it. They had survived. They had starved the parasite of its fear, and it had retreated, dormant once more. They left the apartment the next day. They packed only what was essential and left the rest. They didn't even look at the board as they walked past it. They left the key on the counter and didn't look back. They never spoke of it again. The memory was too painful, too terrifying. Ben recovered slowly, but he was never the same. He was withdrawn, and a flicker of the old paranoia still lived in his eyes. Liam and Chloe's friendship, too, was fractured. The whispers had revealed too much, exposed too many secrets. They could never look at each other without a flicker of the distrust the board had planted. They tried, but the tendrils of Malachi's malice had woven themselves too deeply into their lives. Years passed. They drifted apart, as old friendships sometimes do. Liam moved to a different city, started a new life. He never bought another antique, never walked down a dark street without a chill running down his spine. One night, he was alone in his new apartment. He was flipping through channels, and a documentary on the supernatural came on. The narrator was talking about Ouija boards, calling them harmless toys. Liam's hand froze on the remote. The narrator showed a picture of an old board. Liam's blood ran cold. It was the board. The same intricate carvings, the same faded wood. The narrator explained that the board was a historical artifact, a piece from the famous medium, Eleanor Vance. It's now housed in a small, private museum in the city where she disappeared, the narrator said, and gave the address. Liam, for the first time in years, felt a deep, profound fear. The museum was in the same city he now lived in. Later that week, Liam, driven by a morbid curiosity he couldn't control, found the museum. It was a dusty, forgotten place, run by an old man with eyes that seemed to hold a century of secrets. He walked past exhibits of old psychic artifacts, of crystal balls and tarot cards, his heart pounding in his chest. And then he saw it. The Ouija board was in a glass case, a single spotlight illuminating its dark wood. It looked harmless now, a forgotten relic. He moved closer. He read the plaque. Eleanor Vance's speaking board, believed to have been her last. He stood there for a long time, watching it. He felt nothing. The coldness was gone. The whispers were gone. It was just an object. Just wood and ink. A sense of relief, a pure, unadulterated joy, washed over him. He was finally free. The board's power was gone. He could leave. He could live his life. He was about to turn away when he saw it. In the faint reflection on the glass of the case, a figure stood behind him. It was a small, thin boy. It had no face, only two deep, empty sockets where eyes should be. And it was holding a photograph. The photograph of the little boy, Malachi. The figure smiled, a wide, malevolent grin that stretched from ear to ear. The grin was not on the boy's face, but on the glass of the case. The grin of the parasite, the sleeper. And then, Liam saw the name scrawled on the back of the photograph. It was no longer Malachi. It was his own name. Liam. The whispers began again, and this time, they weren't in his head. They were in the room. We never left. We were only dormant. And now, you are here again. The final whisper was a familiar, sibilant sound. You invited us in. Now you are ours. Story 2. The whispers of the board. The grinning boy in the reflection wasn't just a flicker of light or a trick of the eye. It was a truth, cold and solid, that slammed into Liam's chest. He whipped around, but the museum behind him was empty. The old man was nowhere to be seen, and the only sound was the low hum of the display lights. Yet the feeling of a presence was overwhelming, a tangible weight on the air that felt colder and more predatory than any he had ever known. He looked back at the glass case. The grinning reflection was gone, but the name on the back of the photograph, previously unseen and then his own, now read, Eleanor Vance. It was a cruel, final twist of the knife. The parasite wasn't just dormant. It had never left. It had simply shifted hosts, a symbiotic horror clinging to the person who gave it power. Panic seized him. He stumbled backward, knocking into a pedestal holding an old crystal ball. The ball wobbled, but didn't fall. He needed to get away, to run. But where? The last time he had fled, the parasite had followed, patiently waiting for him to return. The museum door, which had been ajar, swung shut with a hollow thump. He was trapped. The whispers began again, not as a chorus this time, but as a single, dry voice, coming from the board itself. You came back to me, just as I knew you would. He had forgotten the most important lesson from Eleanor's journal. The parasite's power was fueled by acknowledgement. He had looked at the reflection, he had read the name, and he had fled in terror. He had fed it. He forced himself to stop, to breathe. He closed his eyes, remembering the wall of glass he had imagined years ago. He had to starve it again, to cut off its supply of fear. He focused on the mundane, on the cool marble floor beneath his feet, the sound of his own breathing, the faint scent of dust and old paper. He mentally repeated a grocery list. Milk, bread, eggs. Milk, bread, eggs. The whispers in his head began to stutter, to falter. The feeling of a presence lessened. It was working. Then he felt a searing pain. A sharp, burning ache in his hand. He gasped and opened his eyes. The pain wasn't real. It was a phantasm, a psychic assault. He looked at his hand, and for a moment, he saw the grotesque image of a thin, spectral child's fingers wrapped around it, the ghostly touch leaving an invisible burn mark. You cannot ignore me. Not this time. The voice was stronger, angrier. It had learned. Before, its power was limited to psychological torment, to the subtle sowing of chaos. Now, it was directly attacking him, trying to break his will. It had been nourished by a century of fear, and it was a more formidable foe. Liam knew he couldn't simply ignore it. Not when it was capable of such a direct assault. He needed to destroy it. To kill the parasite and its host. He looked at the board in its case. The glass. He could break the glass. But with what? The museum was filled with fragile, ancient artifacts. His eyes darted around, searching. Then he saw a heavy, bronze-plated fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. He grabbed the fire extinguisher, his heart pounding. The moment his hands touched the cold metal, the parasite's voice in his head roared with a sound like 1,000 angry hornets. No. You will not. The air grew so cold it hurt to breathe. A spectral presence, thin and shapeless, flowed from the display case and swirled around him, its icy touch raising goosebumps on his arms. He swung the fire extinguisher back, aiming for the glass. The air vibrated with a malevolent energy, and he felt a sharp shove on his back, a force that sent him stumbling forward. He recovered and swung again. The shadows in the room writhed, taking on grotesque shapes, long-fingered hands, gaping maws. The whispers were a deafening cacophony. You are a fool. I will shatter you. I will consume you. He swung with all his might. The fire extinguisher hit the glass with a deafening crash. The glass shattered into a million tiny, glittering shards. A triumphant howl filled the air, a high-pitched shriek of pure rage. The howl wasn't from the parasite. It was from the old man, the museum's curator, who had just emerged from a back room. His eyes, once so vacant, were now wide with a profound, terrified recognition. "What have you done?" the man shrieked, looking at the broken case. The parasite, sensing the man's fear and outrage, saw a new opportunity. It lunged, a black, viscous cloud, flowing out of the shattered case. It bypassed Liam and headed straight for the old man. Liam yelled, "Don't acknowledge it. Don't look at it." But the old man, a lifetime spent studying and cataloging these artifacts, couldn't help but be a host. He knew what he was seeing, what was happening. He looked at the black smoke, and fear, a deeper, more primal fear than Liam's, took hold of him. The parasite latched on, enveloping him. The old man's body shuddered, his mouth open in a silent scream. Liam realized with sickening clarity what was happening. The parasite wasn't a single entity. It was a psychic virus, a contagion. It could live in the board, or it could live in a host. And he had just handed it to someone else. He had been a carrier, a vector. He looked at the board, lying now on the pedestal, the glass shards around it. He picked it up. The wood was no longer just cold, it was radiating a low, throbbing heat. He saw his own reflection in the glass eye of the planchette, his face pale and etched with terror. He knew what he had to do. He had to destroy it. All of it. He ran to the back room, ignoring the now silent, possessed figure of the old man. He saw a storage closet and a fire alarm. He pulled the alarm, and the shrill sound filled the museum. He then ran to the back door, but it was locked. He slammed his body against it, again and again. Then he heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and dragging. The old man was coming. The parasite had taken full control. It was coming for him, its host, its source of power, now an enemy to be eliminated. He turned and saw the old man standing there, his eyes twin pits of malevolent darkness. The man's mouth twisted into the same lipless, wicked grin he had seen in the reflection. "Why are you running?" the dry, rasping voice asked, coming from the old man's throat. "Don't you want to play?" Liam threw the Ouija board with all his strength. It spun through the air and hit the sprinkler system, the brittle old wood splintering against the pipe. Water. Fire. Water. The word echoed in his head. The board was made of wood. Wood and ink. He had tried fire. Now, he would try water. The sprinkler system, old and dusty, groaned to life. A cold, steady stream of water sprayed from the pipe, dousing the broken pieces of the board. The planchette, still intact, hit the floor and was submerged in a growing puddle. A scream, long and piercing, tore from the old man's throat. The parasite writhed, a dark, smoking shape, as if a million tiny, unseen insects were being burned alive. The old man collapsed, the parasite's hold on him broken. The water was hitting the board, and the ink that formed the letters began to bleed, to run. The words on the board's surface melted, a black, oily stain spreading through the wood. The letters, the numbers, the yes and no, all blurred into an illegible, meaningless mess. The screams faded. The whispers stopped. The coldness lifted. Liam, drenched and exhausted, stood there in the silence, listening to the drip of the water. It was over. The host was gone. The parasite was gone. He had not only starved it, he had dissolved its anchor to the world. He left the museum, walking out into the pouring rain. He never went back. He never spoke of it again. The memory was too heavy, a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. He had been a part of something ancient and terrible, a brief link in a chain of fear and madness. The experience had taken a part of him, an innocence he could never get back. Years later, he would sometimes see a familiar figure in a crowd, a man with a perpetually tired expression, a woman with a defiant gleam in her eyes. He would look away, pretend he didn't see them. The bonds had been forged in fear, but broken by the parasite's own malevolence. He had survived. But he was alone. The last whisper was his own. He would feel it sometimes, a cold, phantom touch on the back of his neck, a question that he could never answer. He would feel the weight of a secret he could never share, a truth that no one would ever believe. The whispers were gone, but the echo remained. The echo of a voice that was both a warning and a promise. A voice that had always been his own. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.